webinar which we're recording, and also the previous ones that we've had in the past few weeks will be found at our website. Today, it is an exciting day for us because we have Elias Chipimo, who has many hats. But for today's session, he is co-founder of MentorMe. I'll give him an opportunity to introduce himself as he begins his presentation. But today's session is on an SME's most important asset during a time of crisis. So I will allow Elias to go ahead with his presentation, but please, if you have any questions about the topic and any contributions, feel free to write them in the chat and we shall address them at the end. We shall give about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So there will be no, Elias will not respond to your questions and answers as he's presenting, but we shall reserve that towards the end. At this point, I would like to hand it over to Elias. Elias, take it away.
Thank you very much, Peter. Let me just start by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where it is that you're watching from. I'm delighted to be able to participate in Bongo Hive's webinar series. This is a very interesting and a very challenging time. But let me perhaps start with a story. 10 years ago, two men decided that they were going to meet in a remote location. They headed out to an area that was very hilly, parked their vehicle at the bottom of one of the hills, and after about 10-15 minutes, they reached the summit and they began their meeting. Within about 30 minutes, they were surrounded by 4 armed men. Now, 2 of those men had AK-47 rifles, and they were shouting instructions at the top of their voices. The only thing that prevented these 2 men from being shot, or worse still, seriously injured and killed, was that they remained calm, clear-headed, and curious. Now, you may well be wondering, is this story really true? Well, I know it's true because I was one of those men. Not the armed men, of course. I was one of the 2 gentlemen that had decided they were going to meet at this remote location. Now, I'll tell you a little bit later, a little bit more detail around how I ended up in that situation. But for now, I think it's just important that I explain that this is really something that will underscore the theme of the presentation today. And what I want to talk about is an SME's most important asset in a crisis. So there's 5 areas that I want to cover in the presentation. The impact of COVID-19 and the protocols that have been put in place on current and future business. 3 critical survival factors for SMEs that you'll constantly hear spoken about during this crisis period. The importance of calmness, clarity, and curiosity. Then I want to talk about how we move forward using the acronym CALM. But prior to that, I want to just explain 3 things that I think it's important that we keep in mind as we think about how to move forward in the middle of this pandemic. The impact of the COVID-19 protocols, just the current impact. There are 3 things that I've identified are probably useful reference points to explain the crisis and the implications of the crisis. The first is this issue of human movement. Now, the industry that has felt this most acutely is, of course, the tourism sector. Because generally, if you look at the statistics on tourism, and this is an estimate from the Harvard Center for International Development, the value of this industry is $1.1 trillion. That's 1 and 12 zeros. Constitutes about 10.4% of the global GDP and about 7% of global exports. So the impact there, because of the limits on human movement in order to curtail the pandemic and its effects, has meant that this industry has been perhaps the most immediate and directly impacted, and the implications are felt right through the value chain. Second, of course, is the issue of supply chain disruptions. Clearly, with those disruptions, it's meant that it's impacted economies that are export-oriented. And of course, it's also impacted foreign direct investment and trade. But third, there's also the impact with regard to the commodity demand. And typically we can look at things like oil, copper, food. Many of you will have seen the stories going around the media around what's happening with oil. And it's interesting because the oil story is not really one of, it is partly a supply and demand issue, but the big problem that the industry is facing at the moment, especially the large-scale producers, is that there is no storage capacity, which is why for the forward trades on oil, so oil for delivery in May, for example, last week, because there were challenges around storage, was actually being offloaded by the oil companies at a negative value. So they were literally paying people to take the oil because they didn't have anywhere to store it. And there's a challenge with the oil sector because in some instances you can't close off an oil field. You may not recover it, or it may be more expensive to restart it. So they have to keep producing. And right now, if you're in the industry of storage, you're probably doing pretty well. The copper story is slightly different. For us, our major market is China. And of course, with China having slowed down as a result of this pandemic, it's meant that there's been reduced demand for copper, constitutes over 70% of our export earnings. And so therefore, we've had an immediate effect. It had an impact on us almost immediately. And of course, in various parts of the world where you have significant food production, because of the closure of schools and restaurants and other areas where there would be high consumption, people are actually having to throw away or discard huge volumes of their produce. But that's past implications or current implications. But let's look at what potential positive things are there. So maybe let me just quickly go over what I'm just going to cover. It's just the impact, critical survival factors, and I haven't yet gotten into that part of the presentation, the importance of calmness, clarity, and curiosity, and then 3 things that need to be kept in mind before explaining some suggestions on how we move forward, or anybody working in the SME sector can actually move forward positively in the light of the crisis that we're currently facing. And so we spoke about the human movement, the supply chain disruptions, and the commodity demands, and this is the current impact. And of course, these are all negatively affected, largely by and large. There are some industries that will benefit during this time. Anybody that's producing protective equipment or equipment that's to be utilized for addressing the respiratory challenges and some of the conditions that people will be experiencing as a result of being infected by the coronavirus. They will obviously be doing extremely well during this time, but by and large, there will be a net negative impact on a lot of industries, particularly those that are driven by the oil sector, copper, and food production. But we can get now back to what some of the future business implications might be. And this is really where I see opportunity. And the first is that in terms of payment systems, there's a recognition that this is now no longer just a security matter, but it's actually a health matter. And so what you've seen, and Zambia represents a good example of that, is there's been a policy response to remove some of the barriers towards cashless trading. So the Bank of Zambia, for example, has lifted the thresholds with regards to know your customer obligations and also the amount of money that can be transferred or held in mobile format in order to facilitate payments through electronic means rather than to have cash as the medium for exchange. This is positive, and I believe that it's something that will survive the protocols that are in place to address the immediate dangers of the pandemic. The second area is what I would call remote work or education or services. And I think this will become more of a norm as businesses clearly start to see the gains in terms of efficiency when it comes to the remote delivery of these services. And this will impact all industries, including those that perhaps traditionally one might have perceived as needing to have face-to-face or physical engagement in order to have those services delivered. And it could even include things like telemedicine and areas that might look as though they actually need a physical presence of a doctor or a nurse And it won't, of course, be all sectors, but by and large, there'll be a creeping in on a permanent basis of this remote approach to delivering services. The third area, I think, is with regard to the outsourcing of local delivery of physical goods. I think this will become a much more recognizably relevant business avenue. And there are various entrepreneurs, even here in Zambia, that have struggled to get this type of business fully developed. But of course, with social distancing, the protocols around maintaining safety of space between individuals, this will now become a much more visibly profitable area for investment. And then lastly, and not least, is the question of local supply chains. Clearly, with international trade having been badly affected, there will now be a much greater dependence in order to meet what will be an ongoing internal market demand, the needs of local communities. So these are very clear opportunities, but they need to be thought through very carefully, and the opportunities identified in terms of the role that SMEs can play within the broader value chain for addressing these challenges. Now, when you read the literature or talk to people about what the impact is and what the critical survival factors are for SMEs during a time like this, you will typically get a response that will address one or all of these issues. That you need to have cash, either cash reserves or cash flow, in order to meet your immediate and ongoing obligations. Without cash, there is no way that your business will survive. So cash is necessary. Very few people are going to be extending credit during this time because of the uncertainty. And the challenge that's there is not so much that there is uncertainty, but that the uncertainty is undefined. Nobody knows how long it's going to go on for. Nobody is able to really see what the contours of and the parameters of this pandemic are going to look like over the next few months. The second area that people will identify as being critical is customers. Now, you need customers in order to ensure the survival and continuity of the business, particularly when you look at things like the tourism sector, where hotels, in some cases, and some of the very large hotels have had to shut down, and even some of the smaller lodges, and had to reorganize the way in which they deliver their service. This is quite a critical issue. So even if you have the cash reserves, because of the undefined time frame within which these protocols will be applied, it's very likely that you will run out of cash at some point, unless, of course, things are resumed back to the normal pace prior to that time. But it's more than likely that many SMEs will not have sufficient cash reserves to see them through to the end of this particular pandemic. And then, of course, there is the issue of connectivity, because to overcome the lockdown and social isolation protocols, in order to prevent the disease, this becomes the main means of communication. So these are important and critical factors, but in my mind, in the middle of an undefined crisis, they're actually not the most important factor. And I think that really that's an issue of mindset. The importance of calmness, clarity, and curiosity. And why I say this is that people will set out approaches to how you can plan your different scenarios. But if you're already facing the crisis of a limited amount of cash, if you have customers that are deserting you, then it's very difficult at that point to plan in a way that can ensure your continued survival. And we shouldn't be looking at this as something that is purely about surviving this era. SMEs should be trying to identify ways that they can not only survive, but thrive beyond the period of the pandemic. And it's going to be important that there is the right mindset applied as each SME looks at the challenges of this pandemic and what it brings to their unique businesses. And I think there are four things that, if we are careful and diligent and don't panic, that as SMEs, you will be able to draw from this experience. And the first one is this question of collaboration. Now, collaborating is always more efficient and it's usually more cost effective. And it's also quite empowering because there's a cross-pollination that takes place with collaboration. Things that you will learn in your industry, in your specific sector as an SME, that SMEs in other sectors can teach you or that you can borrow from. And particularly those that are working in the IT sector, there is huge scope for collaboration with areas that traditionally wouldn't have been seen as being aligned. I can give you an example from my own practice as a lawyer. I'm no longer practicing as a lawyer, but certainly the first thing that came to mind was that we have a law that allows for electronic signatures to be deemed effective for purposes of concluding contractual arrangements. Now, historically, you would have to travel either abroad or to a particular local location, meet, exchange documents, and do all of that signing. But now with DocuSign and various other applications that are available, it's very possible to conclude a multitude of agreements across many different time zones and countries, and do it in a way that gives the same legal effect as though that document was signed physically in the presence of all the relevant parties. That's, again, a collaboration between information technology and legal services. We talked a little bit about telemedicine and the opportunities that might be there, particularly with things like remote diagnosis. 10 years ago, I recall visiting an individual that was working on a very simple but effective way of doing remote diagnosis using a cell phone with a camera. You simply took the sample, whether it's saliva or blood, took a picture, and through a microscope that was attached to the camera, and this was sent via SMS to a laboratory. It wouldn't matter where it would be, no matter how far, as long as it could be carried over the internet or on the SMS signal, and the diagnosis would be done by a computer and sent back. This is efficient, it's cost effective, and it empowers local communities. So this kind of collaborative effort will become much more of the norm in the light of what's been happening with COVID-19. Then there's the issue of creativity, finding new ways of doing things, which is brought about by this reordered world that we now face. The issue of cost controls, they're all sort of pointing to the same thing. And then there's the issue of customer care and stakeholder management. Many industries will be faced with the prospect of what they do with their staff, how they manage their suppliers, how they address the shareholder needs, how they deal with the pressure that will be coming from their financiers. If there isn't a deliberate and carefully thought out process, then it's possible that you may act too soon or act in such an impromptu fashion that you damage the prospects of rebuilding a business that can thrive beyond this pandemic. So it's absolutely vital for SMEs not to react, not to overreact, but to respond. And that response requires a calm, clear, and curious mind. So before I venture into giving some suggestions about how we can move forward, I'd just like for us to keep three things in mind. The first is that for the first time, the quality of online educational tools, and a plethora of them are accessible for free, has never been so diverse, readily available, and affordable. Various universities in the West and various institutions are offering free educational platforms to learn about the different variety of things that you may need for your business. One of the big challenges with SMEs and SME development is the limited managerial capacity, whether you're looking at corporate governance issues, whether you're looking at accountability in terms of your systems and controls, whether you're looking at financial education. There are numerous tools that SMEs can utilize this time to access, and many of them are for free. Secondly, the cost of access has never been so cheap. Now, I understand that the costs of accessing the internet in Zambia are relatively high and data costs are relatively high. But when you look at it on a cost-benefit basis, the value that you derive, and there are different ways in which you can access and download material so that it's stored on your database of your phone or your computer or your laptop or your iPad, so that you are streaming the information that you're downloading at a time that the rates are less harsh. So there are creative ways around addressing this problem of the high cost of access. But relatively speaking, access has never been this cheap. And then thirdly, there's a huge window for learning and growing in entrepreneurial success. And I'll say a little bit more about this later when I talk about one of the steps going forward that I would propose that SMEs reflect on with the right mindset. So let's look at them. How do we move forward? And I'm using the acronym CALM to explain how we move forward with this. So, first of all, you do need to have a clear mindset. Now, why is that important? Because it helps you to navigate uncertainty without panicking and without making decisions that you might later regret. It enables you to work in a manner that takes a more holistic approach to the challenges that you're facing as an SME, rather than the knee-jerk reaction to each issue that emerges. You do have to take each issue one at a time, but you want to do it in a way that understands the broader impact of each of the steps that you're going to make. And that requires a clear mind. Clear mindset also helps you to perceive any unforeseen threats to your business. And I'll say a little bit more when I look at how you align your business to the sources of future growth. A clear mind also helps you to manage the shifting expectations of your customers and stakeholders. And it's important that there is a line of communication that is maintained that reflects your authentic challenges that you are facing. I think we're living in a time when there is a great recognition of the need for us to work together. Suppliers, consumers, everybody recognizes that these are unprecedented times and that we're only going to succeed individually if we succeed collectively. So this is really a time for authentic communication about the real challenges that you're experiencing as an entrepreneur. And then lastly, I think a clear mindset will allow you to more concretely identify all of the opportunities that lie ahead. And I want to say a little bit more about this, what I call value chain-based scenario planning, because many of you will have heard from different presentations and heard from different people that one of the ways to address challenges that are unforeseen is to look at scenario planning. So you consider that, what if there was to be a major epidemic? How would your business be structured in order to address the challenges that emerge as a result of that? But I'm suggesting that we go a little bit further and look at what I call value chain-based scenario planning. And this comes to the second point, the A in CALM, which is aligning your business to the sources of future growth. Now, this requires you to do three things. Firstly, to identify and analyze the various different economic sectors. And I can give you a list, but I will just go through quite quickly what I'm talking about here. Sectors like energy, education, mining, manufacturing, medical services, agriculture, arts and entertainment, tourism, transportation, infrastructure, ICT, construction, communication, outsourcing, logistics, general services, and research. Now, it's not an exhaustive list. I've just listed 17 things. And of course, each one of those can be broken down even further. And this is the work that I believe needs to be done by the SMEs, not just for your current situation, but remember, you're looking beyond the COVID pandemic. You're looking at the scenario that is likely to prevail once everything is settled, whether it's through the discovery of a vaccine or by some miraculous development. This problem just goes away. It's not likely to. And I think it will require some kind of medical intervention. But you need to be looking at your business beyond just surviving this period of time. And so it's really breaking down those sectors and then identifying the variety of available value chains within each sector. And there again will be a plethora of different types of value chains. And as an SME, you need to be looking at this from the point of view of being part of that supply chain. So For example, right now, everybody is talking about producing face masks. Well, where are they getting the rubber bands from that help to tie those masks? Or where are they getting the cloth from? Or where is the dye being procured from? Is this an area that an SME could play a role? This is the kind of approach that one needs to be looking at, but breaking down each and every potential value chain and identifying the extent to which your unique configuration as an SME might be able to tap into the opportunity to be part of that value chain. And of course, you need to consider the impact of different scenarios on each value chain. So you can be as expansive as you want in terms of how you consider these scenarios. You're imagining that there might be an earthquake, or you imagine there might be a shutdown, or you might imagine there might be a flood, or you imagine there might be absolutely no power whatsoever because there's been a breach of the dam at Kariba, and therefore plunging the country into darkness for an undefined period of time. These are all the scenarios that you can think through, but it's about thinking about them in the context of a specific value chain that you are uniquely placed to be able to participate in. So we've talked about keeping a clear mind. We talked about aligning your business to the sources of future growth. Then I want to talk about the continuous learning, and I've mentioned this earlier already, that there is a plethora of resources. There's almost as many resources for learning as you can care to imagine. There is really no limit. But I do want to bring your attention to two particular sources that I found very useful during this time. One is a book written by an MIT professor who teaches on entrepreneurship called Bill Olet. And he's written a really interesting book. You can access it for free online, called The Disciplined Entrepreneur. And he makes some very interesting statements in there. He sets out a 24-step process. It's not in logical order. In other words, you might start with step 1 and 4 and work into step 20 and then work back. And he explains all of this in a very clear and coherent way. And there are a lot of gems in there that can help to guide your steps as an entrepreneur. But his central point is that an entrepreneur is not necessarily born, and that entrepreneurship can be taught. And he sets out the disciplines that result in successful entrepreneurship. And he puts to bed some of the myths around being an entrepreneur. And I think it's an extremely useful, engaging, but very instructive guideline for how to be more successful as an entrepreneur, particularly those running small and medium enterprises. There's also podcasts from various radio stations. The ones that I find most instructive are actually the BBC podcasts. So if you want to know anything about, for example, why oil went to negative $37 a barrel, there are podcasts that explain this in clear, simple terms. Now, why was I listening to a podcast about oil? Well, because as an entrepreneur, I'm looking to establish a biodiesel operation. Now, it's important for me to understand what the impact of low crude oil prices is going to be on a local biodiesel production facility. And so this is where I get my information, and I'm able to calibrate my plans going forward on the basis of the expert information that emerges out of these sources of information. They're reliable, they're trustworthy, they're dealing with the best experts, and they're also explaining it in a manner that's extremely simple for you to understand as an entrepreneur. And of course, there are many non-subscription publications and papers, so it's not going to cost you money. You just need to click on the link and you have access to some very, very useful information that you can now almost prepare your own material and information for purposes of teaching yourself, but even for purposes of engaging with others. So the key point is that you've got to utilize this time to establish a continuous learning process. And the hope is that this will go beyond the pandemic and its implications and actually become part and parcel of how you run your enterprise. And the last of the areas, the last of the letters in my acronym CALM, is a mastery of these key areas. Staying calm, clear-headed, and curious, aligning your business with the source of future growth, learning everything you can that's relevant to the survival and growth of your business, and mastering these areas for purposes not just of surviving, but of thriving in what I think we can all agree is fast becoming the new normal. So you remember I started with a story about two men who ended up on a hill, the summit of a hill, and they were surrounded by 4 armed men, all barking out instructions at the same time, 2 of them with AK-47 rifles. I was one of those 2 men who were staring down the barrel of these guns. How did I end up there? Well, 10 years ago, when I made the decision that I was going to change my career and go into public service, I decided to go on a 40-day fast. And I fasted with a colleague from my church. And we decided that on the very last day of the fast, it was a Saturday morning, we would meet on the top of a very high hill. And so we drove my Land Cruiser out to this area. We parked the vehicle at the bottom of the hill and climbed our way to the top. Now, this was a time, 10 years ago in Zambia, when there was a spate of armed robberies. And the particular favorite vehicle of armed robbers was, lo and behold, the Land Cruiser. And so the villagers in this remote area had seen this car drive up to this, the base of these hills. And it turns out that that was an area that many robbers, armed robbers, would take their vehicles to either strip them clean or to share whatever loot they had acquired and abandon their vehicles and go off. So the anti-robbery squad was well prepared for this sort of thing. And they had scouts within the area that as soon as a vehicle turned up there, they would notify the flying squad of the police force. And so they turned up. And that's how we ended up being surrounded by 4 armed policemen barking instructions for us to lie down. And this was the police, put your hands up. It was a whole range of different things that were going on. For some reason, we were completely at peace and totally unpanicked. And we were more curious than anything else. In the end, it all got resolved. We ended up making great friends with these policemen. And the lesson for me was that in the middle of a crisis, the key is never to panic. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Elias, for the presentation, a very insightful presentation. Once again, I would like to iterate that if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat section on the top right corner of your screen, and we shall be able to get to them. And while we're waiting for that, Elias, I'll maybe start off with the first question. You mentioned that some of the sectors that people should be looking at, such as education, where it is more possible to get into. So what is your advice to somebody who, for instance, restaurants are closed at the moment? Would you advise them then to pivot and go into, for instance, making masks, or should they try and concentrate on the restaurant and see how they can make money? Or is it now, are we in a point where survive or get money however way you can?
Well, it's not an easy decision. And I think that what's important is to stick to certain principles. And there's a principle that I always follow. I think that success for me is defined as aligning your pursuits and your goals to the core of who you are. And I think that the beginning of that search for an entrepreneur must be to ensure that that alignment is there and it's intact. When you're facing a crisis, there may be opportunities that present themselves. And as an entrepreneur, you should be in a position to want to seize those opportunities as and when they crop up. But one has to be careful not to simply start selling tomatoes because one's neighbor is selling tomatoes, which tends to be the syndrome that we see, especially across Africa. So it's more a mimicking rather than an imitation. And the difference really is that as long as you fully understand the basis upon which you're going to imitate somebody, and you can address your numbers and look at the value add and assess the opportunity and see whether there is still room for an additional person or for you to exceed the person that you're trying to imitate, then by all means, attempt to go into producing masks. I mean, everybody is producing masks at the moment. And there seems to be no real limit in terms of the criteria. So, for example, there's no health regulations that would prevent you from producing a mask, even if it doesn't meet the criteria that are necessary to ensure that that mask can protect you from whatever the virus is capable of doing. So I would say you need to imitate and not mimic, and you still need to run the scenario of the viability, assess, is this really the viable thing to do? But I think that we always need to circle back to what is it that you as an entrepreneur can do that's consistent with the core of who you are, because then you will have the right passion, the right energy, the right drive, and the right resilience to see it through.
All right, thank you very much for that. We have a question from Muna, and he asks, what ways of doing business, this seems to be systems, standards, or relationships, might entrepreneurs need to leave behind for a better, more efficient, fair, sustainable business world going forward? So I'll read that question again. What ways of doing business, this is in terms of systems, standards, or relationships, might entrepreneurs need to leave behind for a better, more efficient, fair, sustainable business world going forward?
Okay. Look, when I think most entrepreneurs, I think the short answer is try and do businesses that have an impact on people's lives. Yes, so I was saying earlier that it's a function of setting your objectives. If your objectives are about impacting communities, then the philosophy that will underpin the way you do your business will be consistent with impacting others positively. So that is key. But I was also going to just say that I think with entrepreneurs, particularly in developing regions, there are certain challenges that they do face. And one is in respect of capacity, just the managerial skills and competencies, and the questions of connections. And that's why one of the things that I'm working on as MentorMe is to see how we can establish a business angels network so that we can have individuals with know-how, connections, and experience to guide the enterprises around these challenges of lack of access to markets. There's the issue of compliance. You know, are they compliant with the industry regulations? Many people are selling foodstuffs that are not compliant with the Food and Drug Administration Act, for example, or the local government regulations around sanitation and health. Many are not compliant with the Revenue Authority obligations. Many are not compliant with the obligations with regards to corporate governance. So you've got capacity issues, you've got connection issues, you've got compliance issues. I also talk about an issue around productivity and being accountable. Do you have the systems in place internally for financial controls? And is there a commitment towards meeting the stipulations you've set out within your business plan? And I think these things are related to establishing standards. And this is why the kind of businesses that you will find will do well are those that are connected either to an international franchise, because there's an objective third-party standard compliance process, which these enterprises have to meet, or are you part of a value chain for a big off-taker? Because that off-taker will also make sure that you're compliant with the standards that are necessary for that off-taker to buy your goods or your services. So I think the overall issue has to be, if we're going to leave a mark of responsibility and doing business in a way that's ethical, I think we have to have as our objective the idea of a positive impact on people and on the planet. And then, of course, these areas that I've identified that are generally weaknesses for SMEs, which make it hard for financiers and lenders to ensure that they can manage the performance and the default risks that are associated with small and medium enterprises.
Thank you for that, Elias. Una, let us know if your question was addressed. If you'd like to add more clarity to it, you're more than welcome once again. We have another question from Margaret. So she asks, so I just started my business and managed to register it as a limited firm. Shortly, this corona crisis came, and it has proved hard for me in the past days in terms of stock, clientele, and capital. What would you advise me on how to find capital for more stock and physical stock itself? It's really a crisis. It is hard to push. It's hard to push through. So, yes.
Yeah, I think I got the question. I think the big issue here, and this is something that is going to confront many small businesses, and it's something that I spoke a little bit about earlier. Is there a way in which the business that you're doing can be attached to some value chain? Because that's always a comforting box to tick as a potential lender or somebody that is looking to invest. They want to know about the viability of a business. I spoke a little bit earlier as well about a book called Disciplined Entrepreneurship by Bill Olet, who's the MIT lecturer. And he asks the question, what is an enterprise? And of course, people come up with different answers, but his answer is actually a very simple one. It's, do you have a paying customer? Do you have somebody who is saying, I am ready to pay for whatever good or service you are supplying? When you have that, it forms the basis on which you can attract capital, subject to all of those other things that I talked about earlier being in place. But it's absolutely critical to know that you are actually running a business, because many SMEs call themselves enterprises, but they're actually not yet enterprises. You're an enterprise when you have a paying customer, when you actually have a business. So if you are pre-income, as in you don't have a paying customer yet, or you may have a customer, but one that's not ready to pay, then it's always going to be difficult to raise capital. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. But your plan, your business plan, must be well thought through in order to entice a potential investor that, subject to certain conditions being fulfilled, your business will actually commence. So absolutely crucial to have a paying customer so that you can actually call yourself a business. If you don't have that, it's absolutely crucial, and this applies in both situations, to ensure that you have a solid business plan whose assumptions and risks are properly identified and can be explained fully to anybody that is looking to make that investment or loan into your business.
Thank you very much, Elias. Once again, if you've got any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat on the top right of thing. We have one from Susan. I don't know if they're able to answer this one. So she asks, where can one find out more information about the stimulus package released by the central bank to support businesses during this pandemic? And adding to this one, I'd also like to add, what do you say about startups that are looking for this stimulus package or going out to look for loans to sustain their businesses? What should they be wary of?
Look, it's a very difficult period, a very difficult time when businesses are having to adjust, wind down, lay off. So this is really not an ideal time to be out there looking for capital. But as I pointed out, there are businesses that will survive and even thrive through this period. So, how do you prepare yourselves? How do you align yourselves? It's back to the basics. If we look at what it is that makes a business attractive, we look, is there a plan in place? It's all very good to have an idea, but is there a solid plan that has numbers that can back what the enterprise or the entrepreneur or the small, medium sized enterprise is saying that it will do? Absolutely crucial. Then do you have the personnel? And it's got to be somebody that the investor or even the lender will feel has the commitment, the fire in their belly to actually carry the business over the line. Do they have the right processes in place? So systems, financial controls, the issues around accountability, the issues around governance. Are they compliant with the industry regulations and laws and all of the requirements? Have they been fulfilled? Is there anything that could undermine or compromise any license that they may be required to have in order to run their operation? These are really the critical things. But as I say, it's at a time when the overall environment is quite a challenging one until the extent of the uncertainty is better understood. And right now we're dealing with an uncertainty that is itself uncertain. So these are the things that a lot of the small and medium enterprises will be facing as we go through this period of the pandemic. The general estimate seems to be that sort of around September, there should be far greater clarity and perhaps even an opening up. But even that is not a given or a guarantee. So now is the time that SMEs can utilize to address all of those issues around continuous learning, improving their plans, thinking carefully through the different scenarios and looking at what value chain they can actually fit in the event that everything comes to some sense of normality. With regard to the different announcements, the pronouncements that have been made by the government, I think fairly soon there should be a little bit more clarity, particularly around the 10 billion Wacha facility. It's not going to be as straightforward as it appears. And there's always the challenge when it comes to commercial banks, because they're not really structured to understand the pathway to successful lending to SMEs. But there are other institutions like the Zambia Industrial and Commercial Bank and various institutions that do focus on the SME sector that hopefully will be beneficiaries of this fund, and it can flow out to SMEs. But the underlying requirements in order to ensure that the default risk is as low as possible and the performance risk of SMEs is as low as possible. There will be opportunities within that space once these funds are released and there's clarity around how they can be accessed. When that time will be, it's not clear yet.
All right. Thank you. Susan has another question. Tapping from your legal hat, does the force majeure clause in rental contracts apply to the pandemic, and how can an SME pursue this?
Okay, force majeure and the pandemic. Unfortunately, and it's really a contractual issue that will be at play here. At the moment, simply talking about social isolation and a person losing their job as a result of the reduced trade and the restriction on movement of individuals, reducing the influx of tourism and tourists into the country, they do not constitute, for purposes of rentals, force majeure. And it's really just going to have to be, unless of course the contract specifically said that, the rental agreement specifically said that, which is unlikely. And so there has to be an agreement really between the landlord and the tenant. And as I pointed out earlier, really this is it's a question of everybody looking at this problem as a common problem, a problem that we have to resolve together. It's not going to be resolved by somebody saying, let the winner take all, and there's only one winner. This has to be win-win. So there'll have to be a negotiation between the tenant and the landlord. Now, in some other countries, government has actually stepped in and stipulated the protocols that will be applicable. And invariably, they've ended up working on the side of the tenants rather than the landlords. Now, it may well be that maybe there are too many landlords in our own government for that to ever be suggested as a way forward. I don't know. But that's the kind of intervention that would probably help to resolve those disputes which may not have a resolution. The landlord himself, if he is not able to get money out of his tenant, what can he do really? You sue a tenant who's lost their job, who has absolutely nothing. It seems as though the sensible thing to do will be to sit down and say, look, what works for all sides, recognizing that this is nobody's fault.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Once again, if you've got any questions, please, we've got a few minutes. You can put them in the chat. And I'd also like to stress those who didn't register for this webinar, please put your emails in the chat as well, so that we can send you the presentation and links to the webinar. Elias, what would you advise people who have to have difficult conversations with their staff in terms of laying them off from employment because the businesses cannot sustain them, considering that most of these people perhaps are breadwinners, and it might be one of those necessary but difficult discussions to have?
So I want to share a story with you about a company called Barry Way Miller. It's a company that makes machinery and equipment for the production of different things, whether it's toilet paper or cardboard boxes. And they're a company that went through the challenges of the financial crisis in 2008. And their philosophy is that everybody matters. Everybody, not just the chief executive or the senior management, but everybody. And they wanted to live up to that motto. And so what the management decided to do was that they would ask everybody, and they led by example, to take, I think it was something like 3 weeks of unpaid leave. Their goal was that they were hoping to save $10 million by putting staff on forced unpaid leave. Now, I know we have a provision within our new Employment Code Act, which requires you to continue to pay a basic pay. But this was, in the US, and this is something that is permissible by their law. And so the management led by example. They requested, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks of unpaid leave. And what happened was that because of the philosophy within the organization, individuals that were financially stronger than others decided that they would, instead of taking 3 weeks, they would take 4 weeks, so that somebody who couldn't afford to be off for 3 weeks could take 2 weeks of unpaid leave. And that's how they got around the challenge. Now, because there was this communal approach, and it was led from the management, and they led by example, Barry Way Miller ended up saving not $10 million, but $20 million with that furlough program. Not only that, the subsequent year, they made the highest profits that they had ever made in the history of the organization. Now, if you're faced with this situation as an SME or even as a larger business, I think the key is to lead by example. Don't expect the sacrifice from your employees and staff if you're not prepared to make that sacrifice first yourselves as the leaders of the business. And then I think everything has to be done to manage the communication and keep open channels so that all of the fears, anxieties, the worries, and the concerns have a platform on which they can be properly aired. Thirdly, I think that it's important to run different scenarios so that you're carrying the people along with the decisions that have to be made. It's ultimately going to be management that will make the decision. But management have to be alive to the fact that they are privy to certain information, which allows them to be bold enough to make the decisions that they're making. But if they're not involving the staff, at least in terms of what their thinking is, then the staff may be walking away with an impression that these actions are simply being taken to preserve the best interests of stakeholders other than themselves. And so I think that this is the approach. It's not easy, but with an authentic, caring approach, and one that allows for open communication, and one that demonstrates leadership by example, it's very possible to bring everybody around to the same understanding of the actions that would need to be taken in order to preserve the future opportunity for these employees in the business.
Thank you for that. We have one last question before we wind up. This one is from Wansa. One of the toughest decisions that an entrepreneur has to take is to close shop. Sometimes it may be best to close than continue digging the business into a hole, especially in the current circumstances. What do you think are some of the metrics that an entrepreneur should be looking at that you think would ultimately indicate that the business should close shop?
Well, I think the first thing that has to be understood is that there is an obligation not to continue running an operation if you're not able to pay your debts as and when they fall due. Now, if you are a registered business name, it's a slightly different scenario because you won't be subject to the same rules and regulations as a company limited by shares or by guarantee registered under the Companies Act. Because there are implications, personal liability implications, in the event that you're not able to meet your debts as and when they fall due. So that becomes the first line of reference. Can the business actually pay its debts when they fall due? Because if you can't, there will be liabilities, and there are criminal liabilities associated with non-compliance with that requirement of the law. It may well be that there are cash reserves, and the business has to somehow, or the owners of the business must make a decision as to how long they can stretch their resources to be able to cover their capability of delivering on their obligations to their customers. That becomes another issue that will be a reference for that decision. And then, of course, there is the issue of customers. Do you actually have customers that are paying? Can you analyze the customer base that you have and assess the extent to which they are able to continue to support you as a business? So those, for me, would be the key issues going forward in trying to make this decision about whether you will continue to run the business or whether you should close shop. It's not an easy decision, and sometimes it's probably better not necessarily to say that we will close, but just to say that, well, for now, we will, if you like, temporarily suspend operations, but manage it in such a way that when the business does need to be revived, you're not having to deal with angry customers that felt that you had abandoned them midway through this crisis. So it's dialogue internally and dialogue externally, but never forget the obligations you have under the law and make sure that you comply with those when it comes to being able to meet your debts as and when they fall due.
All right. With that, thank you very much. Elias, any last words for the people on the Hive webinar during this period before we wind up?
Well, maybe I'll just share a little story with you about a gentleman who I visited very recently. He runs a lodge, and he has absolutely no customers. And he was somehow still optimistic about the future. So I asked him, well, what does he do to keep himself going? And he says, well, there are just some lessons that he has learned. One is because the cost of electricity has gone up substantially by over 100%. He's had to look very carefully during this time when he's had no clients at how he can cut his electricity bill, because this is something that he needed to do. If COVID had not come along, he wouldn't have had the space to really reflect on how he could manage to do this. And so he's taking steps to address that efficiency gap. Secondly, he's looking at how he can diversify his operations. So he also operates a shop,
and the shop seems to be still doing okay as part of his establishment. And he's realized that perhaps he should have invested a little bit more time in looking at different avenues for business rather than just relying on one specific line of income. He's also very careful about how he approaches the challenges that he's facing. So he's not trying to solve all the problems at one time, but he's looking at the big picture and taking each problem and solving each problem as it arises, so that there's no panic, there's no unnecessary anxiety, but as each problem crops up, he looks at it within the bigger picture of where he wants to see his business, and then just tackles that business for that day. So all of these things, and I think the final thing is just he's maintained an extremely positive outlook as to what the future will be like once everything is back to normal. And I think that he's kept a small retinue of stuff, and they're able to manage with the little that they have. And all the other principles that I spoke about, he is applying. And so this really is my main message, is that if you keep a calm, clear, and curious outlook, don't panic. Yes, things are going wrong, and things may get worse before they get better. But you will always fare better in a crisis when you have the right mindset. And that mindset has to be one that has an optimistic outlook. Even if the outlook is that you should close your business, perhaps COVID-19 has done you a favor. That business was going to probably close anyway. I have a colleague that sent through a message about a certain activity that she undertakes. And of course, that activity is a physical activity, and it's challenged by the online presence of the very same service that she provides. And so the question is, what should she do? And my response is that, well, maybe you need to think about how to take your business online, or to find some other thing to do. Because if it wasn't for COVID, this was something that was going to emerge anyway. So it's not all doom and gloom. Even if it means closure, perhaps there's a different direction that your business is being steered towards.
Thank you very much with those last words. Thank you very much as well for your time, Elias. It's highly appreciated that you took the time off to share your wisdom with us, and also to discuss and answer the questions of the participants. At this point, I'd like to thank the participants for joining us for this Hive webinar. You can find the sessions or the webinar itself on the website bongohive.co.zm/webinars. You will find this very same webinar and the previous webinars. Once again, I'd like to thank Elias, and thank you all for taking your time off to listen to this webinar. There is one that is happening this Thursday, featuring featuring Sipo Piri, Monica Msonda, and Mark Mondoka. It will be on Thursday at 11 a.m. Please register for that one as well. And at this juncture, it's my pleasure to close this Hive webinar and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would just request that Elias to stay on